Good morning and welcome back to the reading of God's Word. We begin this morning as we look back just briefly. The last video we were at the end of 1 Samuel, the book of 1 Samuel, and the death of Saul. And so now we're picking up on 2 Samuel. We begin with chapters 1 through 8, and we're going to see as David establishes his kingdom. So we get right into it. It's very, very busy here. David is moving along here really fast. Right away in chapter 1 here, this is 2 Samuel chapter 1. And David learns of Saul's death and Jonathan, David's closest friend Jonathan. He learns of their death. And David, as the messenger that brings that message, also explains or actually lies to David and tells him that he's the one that actually killed Saul at Saul's request. But David would have no part of that. Anybody lifting their hand against God's anointed would not stand. So David had that messenger killed here in verse 1. And then it was a long chant, a song or a chant that David gave as you read through that there in chapter 1. Now in chapter 2, David is coronated king over Judah. This is the second anointing of king. The first time was when Samuel anointed him. Now it's actually come to pass here in what we would call the southern kingdom or the kingdom of Judah. Yet this is not quite fully king of Israel yet. So we'll move along in this. So in verses 1 through 7, David goes to Hebron. And in Hebron, that's where Judah takes him and anoints him as king. In the meantime, in verses 8 through 11, we see Abner, and this is the commander of Saul's army, and he takes Ishbosheth king and makes him king over Israel. Technically all of Israel, but it's mostly the northern kingdom because Judah would not have any part of that. Judah is already saying that David would be king. Abner and Ishbosheth will be king. So this is a hint of a divided kingdom here before there is truly a divided kingdom. This gives us two kings at one time. And in verses 12 through 32 here in chapter 2, we find the civil war that goes on here, and the men are put together to fight it out, and David's men wins. So and Ishbosheth has to leave. So Ishbosheth is leaving, and we get into chapter 3 here now, and this is going to be a pivotal point as well. In verses 2 through 5, we get a list of David's 6 sons and about 6 different wives. Now pay attention to Amnon and Absalom. Those 2 characters are going to get into it in a little while because of a sister. So that's coming down the road, and we'll see what actually Nathan is going to predict this. But anyway, so we'll get into that in a little while. So in verse 7 is the big turning point. What happens here is Ishbosheth accuses Abner then of laying with with Saul's concubine. And Abner gets absolutely furious over that, and he abandons Ishbosheth, and he makes a vow in verses 9 through 11, and he makes the vow that he is going to transfer all of Israel over to David. And in verses 12 through 26, he puts all that in motion. Now in verse 27, though, he doesn't get that far. Once he gets started, Joab finds out what's going on. Joab is the commander of David's army, and Joab winds up killing Abner, because Abner had killed Joab's brother Ashiel. Now this is in the past. You should have read about that, and it was a big argument going on back there. But so David in turn now has to convince the northern tribes that it wasn't him that tried to kill Abner. So in verses 31 through 39, as you read that, David is explaining to them that no, Joab did this. I didn't do this, and I did not put him up to it. So Joab, in turn, would wind up eventually paying the price for killing Abner. But as it was, Israel then was okay with the idea that Joab had killed him, not David. So eventually that would put David in good standing with the northern tribes of Israel. Which moves us then over to chapter 4. Now, what happens here with Ishbosheth is kind of like his end. In verses 2 through 12, two of Saul's commanders, Baana and Rechab, kill Ishbosheth and bring his head to David. Now, this is an effort to unite the kingdom. David, again, and he has both of these guys killed because they raise their hand against the house of Saul, against God's anointed. So that happens all over again. And in verse 4, now we meet Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, the crippled son, he was crippled from a childhood. And eventually David would take care of him for the rest of his life, essentially. And that moves us over here into chapter 5. And this is a very critical chapter right here. David is enthroned over all of Israel. Now, in chapter 2 through 11, in chapter 2, verse 11, David is king over Judah, and he was king over them for 7 years and 6 months. And in 5:3, David is anointed king here over all of Israel, and he is 30 years old. Verse 4, and he reigns for 40 years. And so in verses 6 and 7, David right here, now this is fast, this is moving real fast. In verse 6 and 7, David captures Zion, which is where the Jebusites have been for ever since Israel has been in Canaan, and they couldn't do anything with them. But David finally captures it, and it becomes the city of David. It becomes Jerusalem, the city of David. And this is where God would choose to put his name. So that happens here in verses 6 and 7. And then 8 through 10, David begins to build the kingdom. He is doing a lot of work now to eradicate all of the people that are not supposed to be there. There's a lot of cleansing sort of that's going on here. And David goes to war, and in verses 17 through 25, he goes to war with the Palestinians and begins cleaning out all of the land. Then in chapter 6, David decides then he's going to move the Ark of the Covenant from its resting place where it has been for over 20 years. Now he's going to move it to Jerusalem. Only he chooses the wrong way to move this thing. And so we wind up seeing where, number one, is probably not David's decision overall as to that this ark is coming to Jerusalem. Remember back in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 11, and this is where Moses said, and where God will choose to put his name. So this Jerusalem is about to become where God's going to choose. But it hadn't happened quite yet. So he decides to move it, but he moves the ark on a cart. And when he does, we see that Uzzah, one of the accompanying the ark there, the ark almost tips over, and he puts his hand out and touches the ark, and God kills him right there. David gets really, really afraid. He's mad, but it's probably more that David is mad with himself for the way he's been doing this. But he's afraid of God at this point. And then he decides, I can't bring this thing into Jerusalem yet, because he was afraid of God. Well, anyway, you'll read through this story where eventually David does decide to bring it on in. And so that will happen. But the point here is God's holiness never left that ark. So there was the requirement was those poles were in that ark, in those rings, for a reason, and that was for the priest to carry that thing, hand carry the covenant of the ark anywhere it went. So eventually they figured this out, and that's the way they finally get it into Jerusalem. So God's holiness is still there, and it had to be respected. So that gives us, and then finally the ark does make its way into Jerusalem. Then we come into chapter 7 here at the end of this reading, and it is basically the Davidic covenant. Now, on verses 1 through 3, David decides to build a temple for God. But immediately in verses 4 through 17, God reminds David of his history with Israel and everything that he has done, and I have never asked for a place for that, for me to be, for anybody to build me anything until he gets ready for it. And he in turn, verses 16, he gives, this is the covenant. This is the covenant in verse 16. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. David intended to build a house and a kingdom for God, but God was building the house and the kingdom for David. And that's not just for David, that was for the downtrace of David, which would be the Messiah and his kingdom. So you see God moving, God's hand moving is all through this. Everything that's happening is not happenstance. It is not by mistake. It is not by consequence of anything other than it is God's movement of all of these parts to establish his plan, for the plan of Christ eventually to be right there. It's the final plan of the kingdom, the millennial kingdom of Christ, right here in Jerusalem as we continue to move. This is a long ways away yet, but God's moving all of these pieces. And then finally, as he does in verses 18 through 29, David gives us long prayer of praise. And David, he saw that he was not going to be able to build a temple, but he rejoiced in the promise of the future blessings that were coming. He was looking into the future, and God was telling him that this is not something for now. This is something for far down the road. And that gives us the comfort, I think, and we should be praising too. Anytime that God reveals his will in our lives, like he was revealing his will in David's life, we need to rejoice over that. We need to be happy that God is going to use us in a way that he wants to use us, and not us doing the things that we think are the best, because God is obviously going to be a lot higher than we are, and his ways and his thoughts are going to be way up above us. So we see this happening, and we're going to continue with the next video as we see what gets David into trouble here before too long. So with that, I pray that you pray that God will give you understanding and wisdom to know and read and discern what is happening in this time of David, and that he will in turn bless the reading of his word.